Okay, what does truing involve? What does it mean? Verifying, straightening, smoothing, squaring, right? We should be doing all those things. Smoothing, squaring, verifying, straightening. So this is where we get our first round of fixes. We may do some more fixes when we get to the dot paper, but we're going to try to fix them as best we can before we get to that point, right? So before I unpin everything, I'm going to make sure that my seam lines match up. At my shoulder, do my seam lines match up? I had a back armhole drawn in that was different than my front armhole. I decided which one I liked better. And at this point, I can square that intersection. So I'm putting one of my fine lines of my ruler along the seam line, and I'm squaring. What's my minimum amount I want to try to square? A quarter of an inch. So I'm putting that fine line of my ruler, and get closer. You're not going to be able to see teeny tiny little marks that I'm making if you're way far back there. I'm putting a fine line of my ruler on the fold line, and I'm drawing for at least a quarter in either direction. If my markings show that I can keep going, then I'm going to keep going, okay? But I'm squaring that before I remove everything. This is going to help me verify that my shoulder seams are the same in the front and the back, and that when I go to true in my curves, I'm not going to end up with little peaks or valleys. So I've squared the shoulder tip. Now I'm going to square my little high point here. Now, something about squaring. This is a perfect square. It's 90 degrees on either side. Sometimes you have a stylized neckline like we've got going on that's really kind of swoopy. This one, I have a choice. Since I'm not doing a basic block, I'm doing something stylized. I can choose to either square here or go at an angle. But the key is, either way, I'm giving myself a smooth, continuous line. I'm not getting a peak or a valley. So now I'm not doing a basic block. I can ignore a few of those rules. But the one thing here is I want this to be a smooth, blended, continuous line. And I'm choosing to go at an angle because my dots are if I'm laying this more or less flat, my dots are trending on the same angle.
What seam are you on now?
The neckline? Okay. So while each of these angles I'm creating is not 90 degrees, in total they're 180. Does that make sense? So it's one continuous blended line. Okay. I can now unpin that shoulder, and that'll help me look at the rest of it a little bit easier. So I'm truing in another color just so you can see it a little bit better. I want to double check that my side seam is the same length, that my midriff side seam is the same length, and my bodice side seam is the same length, and that if I were to sew this, this works together. I noticed when I was pinning it up on the form that my waist wasn't matching up. So I decided that I wanted to lower my front one. And now even when I unpinned it, it separated again. So here I'm going to square for at least a quarter inch on either side to really establish, here's my length. Okay. And if these don't match up, you'll do the same thing. But while they're still folded, I'm going to give myself some sort of marks on the fold and where the fold goes to so I know I'm happy with those locations. Okay. Underarm. Same thing. So I've established my lengths. If it's pinned smoothly, those should be the same lengths front to back. So when I do go to my dot paper and I go to measure my dot paper, those measurements should be the same. And if stuff is a little bit off, it just has to do with the fact that our fabric is kind of on the bias here and stuff. It might be stretching a little bit.
So you squared the bodice.
I've squared.
Okay.
Okay, now I can separate them. Okay. Now, while they are still pinned together, bodice to, do I want to do this? I think I'm going to true these horizontal seams and then deal with the side seam at the end, because stuff sometimes changes in here. Now, some of you may have noticed your dart may or may not have landed on the princess seam. If you had traced off from your basic block, that's totally fine. If it's not on the princess seam, leave it where it is and mark a notch on your midriff to match that dart. So this notch on mine is like 1/8 of an inch to the right of my princess seam. I don't care. I care that it is directly in line with my dart. Okay? So my dart's already trued in. I don't have to worry about that. The lines are already good. I already know it's on grain, but I want to draw in this waist seam. So I'm going to square my center back for at least 1/4, and I can conceivably go longer depending on where my dotted lines are going. So it looks like I can go for 1 inch or so, because that's where my dotted lines want to be. Okay? Now the rest of this seam, even though it's quite straight looking, isn't going to be perfectly straight. Okay? So don't force it to be perfectly straight. Don't just lop off all that curve that's happening with a ruler. Find a really shallow portion of your curve and true it in. And you may have to do some flipping to get things to blend. Okay. My armhole has changed because some of that dart excess fell out the armhole. So I'm going to put my French curve down again, sitting down at the bottom, trying to get it to line up with that mid-armhole pin along my dotted lines and with the shoulder tip mark. Okay. So this bottom part just happens. Now, we, on our basic block, added 1/4 of an inch right here, right? That was for sleeve. We don't need to have that there if we don't want to. You can decide whether you want to have a wider or narrower armhole at this point. I think I'm going to take mine out just to show a little more skin. And if you're ever in doubt about what direction to put this French curve, refer to the basic block section in the book. It'll show what direction to put this. We don't want it to go that way. It'll put the curve in the wrong place. We want the bulk of the curve to be under the arm. Okay. Shoulder seam is straight. Neckline is curved, but I do want to square at the center back neck. I'm going to leave the side seam alone until I'm done with this piece. So everything's done except for that side seam. I do know it's going to end here though. Okay, so the waist piece, same thing, square your center lines. And we're going to call this waist piece a midriff. Now these curves are going to be similar, but they'll be a little bit different. There's a little contouring and shaping happening. So don't worry if one is curving one way and the other might be curving slightly different way. That's okay.